Sutcliffe's last victim was a 19-year-old student at Leeds University, Jacqueline Hill. Her death led to the setting up of a new super squad of top detectives, desperate to catch a man who seemed to defy every known detection technique. In the end, Sutcliffe was caught quite by chance. He'd put false number plates on his car to go out once more looking for a prostitute to kill. When the plates were checked and the police finally found some of his weapons, he confessed. Once he'd admitted he was the Yorkshire Ripper, Sutcliffe took over 15 hours to tell the police the rest of his story. A story of 13 killings, 7 ferocious attacks, and a gruesome game of hide-and-seek with the police that lasted for 6 long and terrifying years.
And we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Solvable Mysteries Podcast. I hope everyone had an amazing New Year's celebration. I sure, enjoyed myself. I'm joined by Glenn Highcove. Dude, how was your New Year's celebration? Are you excited to talk about a really cool case today? Well, a really interesting case.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Yeah, I mean, we've been under crazy lockdown here in California, but we still got away midweek to go visit Santa Barbara and Ventura, and I've got some good pictures up on my Flickr of that if anybody wants to check that out. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely I'm excited because like you and I have both, I think, done a ton of research about this case, and um, we've kind of like ate, drank, and slept the propaganda about this case for like all week. So I'm definitely interested in inventing my views about a lot of things about it.
Yeah. One thing I want to ask you before we start rolling. Well, first of all, I think we could disclose the case. So we are gonna be talking about the Yorkshire Ripper case. Some of you guys may have already known about this case because it's actually pretty big right now on Netflix. The show called The Ripper. It's a four series show. I'm sorry, and both of us have watched the show in full over the week. I personally liked the show. The question I have for you, Glenn, is have you heard about the Yorkshire Ripper case before watching the Netflix show? Because I personally haven't heard about this case, which was actually, now when I think about it, it's quite surprising because, as I understand, the Yorkshire Ripper, was like the most infamous uh, serial killer from England in recent times. So have you heard about this case beforehand?
No, I was coming in totally fresh. The only well, let me backtrack on that. My wife, to her credit, had watched a couple. Sorry, she'd watched this a couple weeks ago, and she was telling me a lot of good things about it. She was really excited. She was telling me a lot about it, and then I think last week, Dr. Grande did a thing about it as well. Though Dr. Grande's thing was more like kind of perfunctory and like a little shallow. It wasn't kind of his usual work. So after that, I was like, hey, this thing is interesting. And then you and I did a little planning around it and research. And then actually, as I started watching the Netflix, even though I have some opinions about that, I definitely, and I'll say I enjoyed the Netflix series. It was very interesting. I came away from the Netflix series with a whole new appreciation for something that I had no idea had ever happened. I'd never heard of this thing before that.
Yeah, definitely. Same here, dude. I enjoy the show. There were some areas of the show that I didn't like in particular. Well, I wouldn't say I didn't like it because as the show went on, well, I will say the first episode or like the second part of the first episode sort of led me to think. Here we go again. This is gonna be one of those, situations where I don't necessarily agree with what's being pushed here and things like that. But then, as I've, watched the second episode, the third episode, and, the last episode, the fourth episode, I sort of started to understand that, yup, like, initially I thought that, the people were going to just sort of trash the police because they were pushing some sort of an agenda for say. But then as the show went on, and when I actually did my own research about the case, I think the police, I'm sure you will agree, the police didn't handle the situation perfectly. That's for sure, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's funny because, like, I think I mentioned this before. I'm generally on the side of law enforcement, and actually probably even more so kind of pro law enforcement. And that's, within reason, right? But that being said, kind of the ongoing theme of our show, you and I keep on finding all these situations where law enforcement screws stuff up, and it's really frustrating. And it kind of reminds me of that ESPN segment called "Come On, Man," where you're like, "Come on, like you guys keep dropping the ball." So I think that's one thing about doing this show is some of my view of the professionalism of a lot of different police forces has sort of fallen a bit, despite coming probably my earlier biases in their favor. But yeah, this one is interesting. So this one has, I think, kind of probably both good and bad. So it has some bad police work, and it has some other things that, to be fair to that police force, we'll go over. We're not necessarily in their control. They were more like a victim of the era. But then, yeah, there were some things where they messed up. And then the good news is there was also kind of some good old, what they called coppering, some good old policing at the local level that seemed to ultimately make up for a lot of the problems.
Yeah. At this point, I'm sure we're ready to get into the story. I know that you have a little bit more to say, more than I have this week. I have some areas that I will want to sort of hog the show a little bit for like a good 20 minutes, where I will be talking about like certain events that happened. But other than that, I don't really have too many strong opinions, and I will surely just sort of be more of a reactionary co-host on the show tonight. So we'll see what happens. Do you want to get us into whatever we want to start off with, man?
Yeah, and I'll just, I'm glad you mentioned the Netflix show up front, because Netflix is really interesting. You and I have both talked about this before, and I want to make sure when people hear the word Netflix, it's like people fall into two camps. They either totally believe what Netflix does as like gospel, and that's the truth, and that's it, case closed. And then there's people that take the opposite tack, where they're like, well, Netflix is just full of biases, and they're just telling one side of the story, and they're slanted into certain ideological or political direction, and probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. I tend to lean more towards, like, I've definitely heard of Netflix messing up or being biased or missing out on like kind of cherry picking what they consider to depict.
Yeah.
So just everybody should know, however you feel, whatever news network you watch, we're going to be fair to you. We're really going to take that into account. I think the other thing that's interesting here is, coming right off of what we talked about with profiling, this was kind of an interesting case where profiling kind of backfired. I think it backfired almost in the face of the evidence. It backfired in the face of people's expectations a little bit. It's interesting how this is a case where profiling kind of got this case off into like a place where it could have been solved maybe a lot earlier. So that's unfortunate. We're also going to talk about a lot of, this is a little bit different for us. This issue, at least from my end, is going to be a lot more social issue heavy, and that's in part because of the way Netflix spun it. So Netflix, really did choose to tell a really fleshed out story about why this happened the way it did, and to its credit, I think it was worth it, because if you look at it, that's the mistake a lot of people make when they kind of try to reinterpret history from right now, is they kind of apply their mindset and like what life is like right now to like 50 years ago. And like, that's not fair. 40 years ago, let's say, like, things were very different. Like, the UK England in the 70s was very different than it is now in a lot of ways. So I think that, to its credit, Netflix, I think, did a good job of painting that picture. But okay, that being said, what we're going to talk about right now is, the idea of what do you think of or do about somebody that does murders that don't seem to really happen for any particular reason, like even when you take into account their childhood and maybe their psychological history or what happened to them growing up, and maybe somebody that can kind of blend in really well. They say they have sort of a normal job. They don't look super creepy. They're not doing weird things. They don't stick out. And, how do you treat that? Like how do we deal with that as a society, especially if they're able to do what are in fact not just horrible crimes, but almost insanely horrible crimes, almost without detection, to the point where the person we're going to talk about today, I mean, he was referred to by some people as like a terrorist. I mean, and it wasn't political, like a one kind of terrorist would do, but it was definitely terrorizing the population, and it was doing so in a way that seemed intentionally not just to satisfy some kind of internal urges, but actually to, I don't know, bring attention to himself in some way and inflict fear on others. So it's pretty disturbing, and I think we're going to find kind of the intersection between that and some social issues without getting too heavy into the politics, if you know what I mean. And I think people will find this is pretty fair at the end of the day. So, okay, that's the initial introduction. So, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about a guy named Peter Sutcliffe. And who was Peter Sutcliffe? He was just this kind of semi-normal man who was born in Bingley in the West Riding of Yorkshire to a working class family, raised as a Catholic. His parents were John William Sutcliffe, and his mother was Kathleen Francis. Before that, her name was Coonan. There was a little bit of history of domestic violence, from what we understand, in the family. There were some allegations that the father used to beat the mother. There were other kids in the family, but he was born especially small. And it's interesting that this came up in the Netflix series that he was undersized. He was only like 5 pounds when he was born. And even when he grew up, like he was always kind of trailing behind
I want
other
to
kids his age.
just to step in and give you a breather. I want to mention the fact that his father, or not his father, someone from his family, I can't recall right now, actually said that he was a little bit of a mama's boy, if you know what I mean. He was sort of always hanging on to like the mother's apron and things like that. His like other siblings were taller than him, so he was a smaller child, but he did witness like his father, Peter's father, actually sort of, did some domestic abuse towards his mother, and, he saw that. So I think there was sort of I don't remember, was it in the Netflix thing or not, but I think someone portrayed him as a sort of, what made him to do the killings, the horrible things that he did, was actually the fact that he was...
he was a product of his environment.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, you want to get into it in more depth.
Yeah, I'll say, I mean, this is so... the person that says it in the documentary is somebody that I have a little bit of stuff to just differ with her about some of her different statements at the end of it. But I'll say this was one of the times where I felt she was right, or had a good observation, that they said sometimes when the father abuses the mother, one of the children will like kind of identify with the mother and defend the mother, but then later they may actually hate themselves and view that as like a weakness in themselves. They almost like kind of flip and take sides against themselves. So
yeah, for sure.
Themselves a little bit.
Yeah, that was definitely. I will say that she was the person that we're referring to. Obviously, probably won't put her in the post production or anything like that. But I didn't sort of felt like she was the one that was sort of. I wouldn't agree with. There was this other woman that I was like, the way her just tone was really annoying, you know what I mean? Even though I was like sort of agreeing with everything she was saying, because she was making sense. But you start watching this show, and if you're like me a little bit, you see this woman talking in that tone, you're like, here we go again, you know what I mean? Here we go again, 2020. But it was actually, she made good points, at the end of the day. I don't have anything bad to say about what she was actually saying, because it made sense, the police definitely messed up here a little bit. So yeah, I think we could jump into more aspects of his life, or
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
So I mean, and it's worth pointing out too. Apparently, he was pretty much a loner even from then, from a kid. So maybe because of his size, and he felt so intimidated by the other kids, and he's seeing his dad, beat the crap out of his mom all the time at home. So maybe he's afraid of physical violence happening to him, and yeah, whatever reason, he doesn't really meld well, like blend, engage well with other kids. Like if you drove by the schoolyard, his dad said if you drove by the schoolyard, you would see him just off in a corner by himself. And I will tell you from what I've studied about human psychology and child psychology, that kind of early either rejection, or even if it's not rejection, it's sort of him rejecting himself. That early kind of social isolation has some very large downstream effects, and they're serious and they're real. So that kind of sometimes it's called rejection sensitivity. So it's almost like you're rejecting yourself, or you're cutting yourself off because you're worried about the rejection. So okay, enough about that for now. Needless to say, frankly, he doesn't seem like it was a very smart guy. Now, someone would argue, well, he came from a background that maybe wasn't encouraging him to succeed. But I don't know. There were definitely people that came from that background that did actually go on to Oxford and places like that. So, he left school at age 15. He ends up working at a lot of menial. That's Wikipedia says menial jobs, and I agree. 2 stints as a gravedigger in
Wow.
the 60s. Yeah. So that's where he apparently came up with a pretty dark sense of humor. I can imagine them make him pretty strong though, too, right? If you're digging holes all day.
Wow, dude, I just want to ask you, could you imagine leaving school at 15 to go become a grave digger?
Dig
What
holes.
the hell is that, man?
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty grim job, which
Yeah.
kind of makes you wonder if he had a lack of sensitivity to go be able to take that jobs. And
Exactly. I think this is. I just want to stop here for 1 second. I think it's very important, because I personally would at 15 digging graves. I would be probably too depressed, to do that type of a job. I just want to ask you a question. Could you imagine
yeah,
yourself at 15 leaving school and going to dig graves? I think this is not some detail that we could like brush off that easy, because I think this is important. A dude who
yeah.
leaves school at 15 to go become a grave digger on 2 different occasions. I think these are like red flags. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like it's a pretty weird job. Yeah, no, I couldn't at 15. Forget it. I
Yeah.
was so lazy. Yeah, I mean, but by the way, I can't even see myself digging holes all day. I mean, that seems like a pretty dull job. So, yeah, I don't know. Between that, then he works at like a television factory on the packaging line. Uh, he left this position. It says when he was asked to go on the road as a salesman. So when they actually asked him to do something interesting that required being social and using his brain, maybe the being social part, to be fair, is what scared him off. He left the job, and then he's working night shifts at some other jobs, like just really, really. I won't belabor this too much, but eventually he ends up, he he ended up stealing tires at one of his like stealing used tires at one of his jobs.
Yeah.
He was on like unemployment for a while, and then eventually he becomes a truck driver, or for our UK listeners and viewers, a lorry driver for a company, and that seems to have been his job for the rest of, let's call it, his working life.
Exactly.
So, and I won't. By the way, I don't mean to put down driving trucks. I mean, I actually think driving trucks is a pretty cool job, but I don't think he was a genius. So let me just put it there. That'll kind of feed into some of how I feel about maybe why he did some of the things he did.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't get any indications that he was a very intelligent man. Um, However, I will say that he made, on the day of his arrest, I'm not really sure if we will talk about that, so I'll just leave it for now. But, I read how he got apprehended because the Netflix thing didn't really have those details. But, I will just mention it that after he did the killings and all the souls that we're going to be, going into detail right now, he actually got caught because he was in a car with a prostitute, which, at that point, police officers were looking for people like that, because everyone who was in that position was a suspect or like a person of interest, I would say. And actually, he had a hammer and a knife on him, but he was talking to the police. He actually managed to like sneak away on the day of his apprehension for like a few seconds, because they just thought that he was a suspect, but they weren't sure when they first caught up with him that he was, the Ripper. He actually told the police that he had to go to the toilet, to take a piss or something like that. He actually went to the toilet. He ditched like his hammer or something like that. For some reason, I believe he had still a knife on him. So when he was in the police station, he asked to go to the toilet again, and then he hid his knife in the police station toilet. So I will say that he was not super smart, but he was street smart, in a sense that he maybe he gained this information over, the 5-year period, or maybe even a longer time period, as we now know, of these attacks. Maybe he gained like some street smart on how to like sort
Yeah.
of avoid detection. So he was definitely not intelligent in terms of like adapting to the society, being productive, and just in general being useful to the society. But he was definitely smart in terrorizing the society. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. He was crafty when it came down to, I guess, the things that were interesting to him. So
Yeah.
gives you almost a sense of like the lost potential of him. Had he, maybe gone a different direction in his life. Okay, so without belaboring this too much, one of the main kind of central points of controversy and themes, both in kind of the general body of literature about him and especially in the Netflix show, I mean, to the point where you almost get sick of the topic, is this whole thing about whether or not he ever used prostitutes or was ever, let's say, ever had like a business transaction gone wrong with a prostitute, maybe at an early age, that gave him reason to hate prostitutes. I'll listen. I'm gonna just put this up front. From what I can tell, it doesn't really seem like he had any particular grudge against prostitutes. I really think that, for what they kind of, especially what they depicted in the Netflix show, prostitutes represented a class of victim that he could kind of look down on, I guess, even as somebody who was pretty low in society himself. But I think B, the attention was not on. So it's interesting that like someone really stupid might think that like a child is like a helpless victim that you could sort of like victimize, at least someone else's child, for some kind of weirdo out there looking for someone to do something awful to. But in fact, that brings down the whole world on your head, right? Especially if it's, the child is someone that actually cares about their child, they can bring a lot of trouble with it. It seems to me that he was cherry picking people who, in his mind, were people that society didn't care that much for. And that isn't me saying that society shouldn't have cared about them. That was kind of the whole point of the Netflix thing, I think, was you really got a sense for, this society that had all these class divisions and kind of judgments about what people do with their lives. And sometimes the judgments were not entirely incorrect, as we'll see, but definitely nobody deserved to be victimized in this way, or victimized in any way, really. So I think, to me, it seemed to me he was kind of trying to pick people that he thought society would not really punish him that stringently for, or would not react as strongly
Yeah.
as, you know what I mean, if he'd picked on like little kids at the kindergarten or something.
Exactly. Yeah,
If that
that's
makes sense. Yeah.
that's the same feel I got. Yeah, you put it in a really nice way that he wasn't necessarily looking for prostitutes, even though that's what the police investigation was sort of surrounded by, that idea that he was only out for prostitutes and things like that, because I believe he actually attacked random women who were definitely
Yeah.
not prostitutes, and the police actually initially didn't even link those attacks to the Ripper, because they assumed the Ripper only killed, and he only killed prostitutes. Well, he did always try to kill, to my knowledge. He always, every single time he tried to kill, but there were many times where the victims managed to sort of avoid the impending doom of Peter Sutcliffe. But when they reported their sort of attacks to the police, they were like, they were not linking them, because to them, sort of, Peter Sutcliffe, well, they didn't know who, the Ripper was, but the Ripper at that point to the police seemed like an entity that could not fail, always end up killing someone. So if you were not a prostitute, but you were assaulted, that's some other guy. That's not the Ripper. The Ripper only kills prostitutes. So that's like the mental state that police was in. So I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I guess that was the interesting, because to your point, he is, if you look at his picture, I mean, he's sort of a semi-handsome guy. He's apparently he's a kind of also a small man. He's not a big man. So maybe maybe people really had this image in their head, despite having what was called a photo fit, which was sort of like a very high-end, almost like kind of like a drawing made out of photographs that almost exactly matched his face. So it's kind of weird that people kept ignoring it, and they were looking for, I don't know, like a pirate with a patch over his eye or something. I mean, or a monster. Yeah, he's like kind of this small man. He kind of blends in a little bit. I mean, to me, honestly, with the beard and stuff, he kind of looks like the devil. I don't trust this guy, but apparently he had a very easygoing manner.
Yeah.
When he would talk to women, whether it was prostitutes or just women in the street.
Yeah.
So I think he was kind of disarming, and he kind of like didn't. The only thing about him was apparently once you actually sat down there and tried to talk to him, he would just clam up. He didn't have any social skills. He was like a really super boring guy, and maybe that was part of his problem. The other thing is, and this is the last thing before we get into the actual crimes, is he was married. He was married to a woman who actually had some psychological issues herself. So I think supposedly she was actually schizophrenic. She had miscarriages. They weren't able to have kids. And actually at one point she has an affair on him. So with an ice cream van driver. Wow. So maybe there was like some kind of indignities in life piling up on him that gave him a sense that he was sort of on the bottom of like the game of life, you know what I mean? Like the bottom of the social pecking order.
Yeah.
In this, like, definitely British society has its, kind of almost caste system or levels of classes in a way that I think in America we don't see. In America, we do have like some kind of class structure, but in Britain, I think, especially back then, it is so much more rigid. And it's something I think that as an outsider, it's not as easy to detect, but it's to the point where like even like the little variations in your accent will tell everybody around you exactly where you were born, where you lived, and probably even your income. So interesting, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think at this point of the show, I think we could get into the actual crimes now. For the crimes section, I think you have like the initial crimes. I think we have like literally split it in half, 50-50. So I think you could definitely bring us into his like, I guess, initial crimes, because we do have them in chronological manner laid out here in our shared file. I think you will go into more of a just like the casual descriptions or like the general information about those people. When I will be talking about like some of the victims, I do have some grim stuff for everyone. So just a warning beforehand that things will get grim in this podcast for a good like 10 minutes or so. So yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that this will get pretty dark soon.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfect. So it's just a perfect way to describe what happened. So, from what I was able to discern from both the research and the Netflix show, etc., it seems like his crimes had kind of two main sections, two periods. So the first period actually happened pretty early as 1969, so well ahead of the actual murders, where while he was with a friend, he actually assaulted a prostitute. Like, the friend was in the car, he ran off somewhere from the car. Hey, I got to do something. And then what happened was he actually hit a prostitute over the head with like a makeshift blackjack. A blackjack is like, a weight in a pouch that you would hit somebody in the head with. He did it with a rock and a sock, and the rock came out, and it kind of didn't really fail. It didn't really work. It failed. The rock came out. The prostitute was injured. He actually told his friend about it, surprisingly, and that, it's too bad the friend never mentioned it to anybody at the time. But it's interesting that he kind of did that semi-publicly, and supposedly maybe it was in retaliation for something. But maybe it was, like getting cheated out of a transaction with a prostitute, but that's really just speculation. It hasn't been verified. The other times, so what happens is there was a bunch of other things that happened. There was actually another assault he did right after that where he did actually get picked up by the cops, but he didn't get charged. And it turned out this is against I think also a prostitute. And it turned out this lady's husband was already in jail for assault. So, once again, he's kind of unusually lucky in his respect that this is somebody that could have probably beat the crap out of him later, but he got away with it. And then so what happens is about 6 years later, in 1975, you see a series of women, like 3 women in a row, including one of them's a teenage girl. And, you're starting to see a signature method where it's kind of a hammer and a knife or a hammer and a screwdriver. So what I mean is he'll take the hammer and he'll do head strikes with the hammer, usually at the back of the head, to try to incapacitate the person and maybe, obviously knock them unconscious and maybe even kill them. And then he'll use the knife or the screwdriver to systematically penetrate their body, sometimes in a frenzy of stabs. And just fascinatingly, these first 3 assaults, no one actually died, but some of these people were very seriously injured or maimed, traumatized, obviously. One of the victims had to have brain surgery. So, I think this matches often the behavior of serial killers like this, that they escalate in their crimes. So they almost go through a beta testing period.
Yeah.
If you think about it, you know what I mean? They're trying to kind of learn their craft, but obviously not everyone is successful their first time. So, okay. So what happens later is you start to see, subsequent to this, a series of murders of women who were alleged to be prostitutes and often were, around an area of town called Chapeltown. Now, Netflix goes to great pains to a great effort to describe this area of town that had, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, it had been an affluent community. Now it was mostly kind of Afro-Caribbean community that was pretty low income, 21% unemployment at the time. The demographics had changed. There was a lot of racial tensions with the police, so people were not necessarily willing to cooperate with the police.
Yeah, definitely. That was an interesting part. I just want to mention one last thing about the whole area. So we're talking about Leeds in the, I believe, West Yorkshire County. Now, this is definitely what I would say, how there's the Midwest or something like that. This is the UK's version of the Midwest a little bit, but not really, but just a little bit, because it's not around London. It's just around the middle part of, England. And actually, one other thing I wanted to mention, that, Leeds was apparently, I didn't know this before watching the Netflix thing, but Leeds was apparently, you could almost see a Detroit of England. It was the place where all of the production was going on, all of the factories, all of the, I believe, rail cars or something like that was also made in there. It was the hub of the Industrial Revolution that England pretty much was the first country to revolutionize itself in such a manner. But then also the Netflix show mentioned that after other countries sort of went through the Industrial Revolution as well, they were able to produce the goods at a lot cheaper prices than what people were producing in the factories in Leeds, where Peter Sutcliffe was doing his killings. So a lot of the money, a lot of the sort of richer people and the more wealthy communities, they sort of moved back to England, and Leeds just became a sort of a little bit of a forgotten town. Well, nonetheless, it's still a really nice city. I've seen some pictures from Leeds. It's actually a really cool city. I would definitely want to go there someday. But yeah, I just want to give this a little history information that we also can take away from Netflix, that, Leeds was a city on a downswing at, these times. I'm sure you would agree with me, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost analogous to Ohio or Detroit, or like, the Rust Belt in the United States was probably the areas going through what's called deindustrialization. So you're seeing, like I said, it has the remnants of the Industrial Revolution and heavy industrialization coming out of World War II. And then as sort of the economy changes and factories and things are moving out, maybe there's like more abandoned areas. Yeah, it's like there's some amount of poverty. And there's also, like you said, there's a lot of blue collar labor. So there's things that maybe service blue collar labor needs. So especially there was a what's called a red light district, which for our listeners who don't know what that is, that means basically a prostitution area. And basically it was assumed that any woman who didn't match the racial demographics of that area, who was hanging around those areas late at night, fair or not, the assumption was often from police and other people that these people were engaged in prostitution. And actually, to some extent, that was true, not universally, but there was even like kind of I don't know if you call it like a swingers club or, some kind of adult industry kind of club there in the area that also attracted a lot of, prostitution.
Gaiety? You're talking about Gaiety Club?
Yeah, the Gaiety, yeah, where it's like, it's very similar to here when there's adult shops and things. There's always hanging on the periphery. There's always kind of black market sex workers and stuff. So, because people get excited and they want to relieve themselves. So, okay. So what you start seeing to happen is a series of women turn up brutally murdered over the time period of about, let's say, a year and a half, 2 years.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah, where you have, I'm just going to quickly dive into a couple of these, and I'm going to hand it off to your detailed description of some of the later murders. But the first murders are notable because, I mean, on one hand, as Netflix depicts it, these are really sad, pathetic stories. I mean, the first woman is a woman who almost certainly was a prostitute. Actually, sometimes she was described as sadly as kind of a pest. She was alcoholic. She had 4 kids. Her violent alcoholic husband no longer lived with her. And the night she was murdered, she actually left her house that night. She left these 4 very young children alone. I mean, none of them could have been above the age of 8. So I don't,
Wow.
that's a different discussion. I don't even know. I don't know if the pill was available then. I mean, that's sad to think that she had these children and she left them alone. Yeah, like late at night, she would leave them alone in the house, and they knew it too. And she would go off to go drink and I guess to service clients. And there's a discussion later on about how much this person is a victim of society, which she is, but also, what that says about her. It's not good either way, any meaning of the word. But yeah, she was, case in point, struck twice in the back of the head with these very definite, like kind of dime-sized indentations in her head, and very traumatic injuries. I mean, big penetration wounds in her breast and her abdomen. They look like, they said it was very disturbing because it looked like it was done with like deliberate and slow effort over time. Like, so it was done slowly. And the pathologist, said, obviously a very disturbed person did this. The next woman who died, just really, I think, was it like another 2 months afterwards? Do you know?
Yeah, I believe, to be honest with you,
Emily Jackson, yeah.
Yeah, Emily Jackson. I'm not really certain about the exact dates for the initial killings.
Okay.
Yeah,
It was recent. It was like right after. And once again, these aren't exactly in Chapeltown, but they're in the periphery. They're in the area where police assume. Once again, they make very, very, judgmental assumptions about you as a woman if you're in this area late at night, about what your living is or your morals. And like I said, it's not always fair. But in this case, it was just also a sad one. This is a woman that actually had a family, and she was working as a prostitute out of the family van because she and her husband were financially desperate. They were near bankruptcy. They needed money. I mean, and this poor lady, she's
Just before we go further into the deals, I do have like the time date. So the first, Wilma McCann, as you mentioned earlier, I don't think you mentioned her name, but she was murdered. Peter's first murder happened on the 30th of October in 1975. So this woman that we are describing right now, Emily Jackson, she was 42. So she was murdered on the 20th of January of 1976. So it's around like a good 3-month period in between the first and second killing. So I think it's pretty important to mention that, he killed his second victim like a good few months, in the future.
Yeah, and we'll see this with him, that he seems to go about anywhere between a month to like a year between killings, depending on, I guess, how he felt and
Yeah.
maybe opportunity and other things in his life. We don't really have a good insight into that. But yeah, I mean, it's almost always, like I said, it kind of crimes of opportunity against women that are either alone because they're working as prostitutes, or just normal, not quote unquote normal, but let's just say women that were not engaged as prostitutes, that just happened to be walking alone at night, or that took up his offer for a ride, or just, and in some cases, one case, one of the women tried to get away, tried to run away, and he still ran after her and tracked her down. I mean, certainly it wasn't at all necessarily related to a woman's behavior towards a strange man. So it's really important to stress that, like, these are all, no matter what, these are all victims that definitely didn't deserve what happened. But yeah, I mean, in all of these cases, it's interesting. I guess what's interesting, or signature about how he does it, and horrible, is that he's taking these women and he's almost always hitting them over the head with what turned out to be a hammer, and then really just stabbing them and slashing them, and in some cases disemboweling them with the screwdriver or a knife or both. And then here's the other thing that's signature. Like, once again, we talked about profiles of killers and how they act. This is right out of the John Douglas book. He often would stage their bodies or pose them. So in almost all of the cases, he had this habit of sometimes even coming back to the scene of the crime afterwards. But if he didn't do it, then he would do it before. He would drag them out into like either the alley or the street or the park, and have them with like their legs towards the road, their head toward, away from the road, in some place where they would be found. I think there was only one or two of the killings where he didn't do this, but he really seemed to want these bodies to be seen, to have what he did be seen, and what he did was super horrible, super gruesome, and frankly reminiscent of Jack the Ripper. This is why this became known as the Ripper, not just because of what happened later in the case when somebody started leaving, recordings and letters, which we'll talk about, but this kind of mutilation of the bodies was really reminiscent of the old Victorian era Jack the Ripper serial killings that happened to prostitutes, 100 years before that. So, it's at this point, because the Netflix shows goes, and it takes a lot of pains to go through these individual killings, probably like the first 6 or 7 women.
Yeah.
And it really makes the point that, like, yeah, some of these women were prostitutes, some of them weren't. They were all just victimized in horrible ways, and they give a sense of not just that, but like, what's unfortunate is in a lot of cases at this point, there wasn't any semen or saliva. They did have tire marks, which in a couple of cases they were able to record, which turned out to be convenient to the prosecution eventually. But unfortunately, in that era, was not really able to be tracked down very well. They didn't have the kind of computers and databases we have now, or the records, especially UK. I know the US at that point was a lot better about what they call interagency cooperation than Britain was. Like, Britain, even modern Britain, has a really has challenges with that aspect of law enforcement agencies cooperating with each other. It's also interesting that they knew about what size he was, because he had stomped some of the victims, especially early on. The second victim had very prominent boot marks, and then I think the third or fourth victim had like footprints in the blood. I think it was in the poor,
Yeah.
or like run down apartment that she was killed in, that she let him in. She didn't expect this guy was going to do this. So they had some very good physical evidence. They didn't have DNA or anything like that back then. They had some ways of matching blood type and things like that, which eventually did turn out to be useful. But yeah, I think in this case, so in this case, in the Netflix show, which we'll talk about in a little bit after we talk about the rest of the crime, it goes into a whole other sideshow about, like the police's like kind of political machinations internally that were getting in the way, about society. There's a whole long thing about kind of like women's rights and, social order and disorder. But I'll table that for now. I'm gonna turn it over to you for really some of the nitty gritty about just how horrible some of these attacks were.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to mention the fact that I have some details on I would say the killings from his seventh victim to his 13th victim. So I think it's pretty important for us to talk about those details, just for the fact that actually a lot of the time he was almost caught, like every single time. I think he was a very, very lucky serial killer. So I'm just gonna not waste any more time. I'm just gonna jump to the seventh victim, who was Yvonne Pearson. She was 21 years of age. She was from Bradford, and the attack before that, before Yvonne, there was Jean Jordan. So he killed Jean Jordan 37 days before he killed Yvonne Pearson. So only a good month, after he goes in. And now a little bit information about Yvonne. So Yvonne Pearson was a 21-year-old prostitute, and she was murdered by the Yorkshire Ripper on January 21st on 1978. So just around his, middle time, just the middle space of his like killing spree. Her body was not found until 2 months later. So on the night of January 21st, Yvonne Pearson left her two children in the care of a 16-year-old neighbor and went to the Flying Dutchman pub. She left there at around 9:30 p.m. to go earn some money, as she told a friend before she departed. Yvonne was due in court in 5 days later on a charge of soliciting. It would not be her first conviction of this particular offense, and there was a prospect this time of actually going to prison. So she had something to lose. She had kids and things like that. That same night, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, was helping his parents move to a new home. His brother Mick and his father John had assumed that he wanted to go home to Sonia, his wife, because he declined staying for a drink with the family, so they thought he was just going home to see his wife. Now, actually, Peter Sutcliffe bypassed his home when driving from Bingley to Bradford, where he was living at that point, and was soon cruising to the territory of Lumb Lane. As he was driving, he narrowly avoided getting into an accident. He braked suddenly and soon was surprised to see a blonde-haired woman dressed in a black sweater and black pants tap on the front passenger window. They agreed on a price of £5 and soon were on their way to a waste ground at the back of Drummond's Mill, where, Peter's father worked actually. Now, after Yvonne Pearson, had gotten out of the car, Sutcliffe hit her over the head several times with a heavy walling hammer which he had kept under his car seat. Almost immediately, another car appeared and pulled in alongside Peter's car. Now, Peter Sutcliffe pulled Yvonne's body beside an old sofa, and to stop her from moaning and making noises, he actually grabbed handfuls of horse hairs from the sofa that she was dragged to and began stuffing it into her mouth and down her throat, at the same time as holding her nose. After a while, he released her nose just to see if she was still making noises, and she was. So he grabbed her nose again and held it again. Now, eventually, the car that was parked alongside his car drove away. To Sutcliffe, this is his quote, "It seemed like an hour." So before it finally left. Now, once he was left alone with his victim, he dragged her trousers down and bared her breasts and proceeded to start kicking her in the head and on the body. And, at one point he actually jumped on her chest with the weight of both feet. Finally, he hid Yvonne Pearson by throwing soil, rubble, and turf on her body and then covering the makeshift grave with that old sofa. So that's definitely, grim, but I think it's pretty important to say that, this is his seventh victim. He almost got caught, but miraculously managed to, get away with it. I don't really understand how that worked. Now, on January 31st of the same year, 1978, Helen Riedka was murdered by him. So this happened only 10 days after the last killing. I think this was the shortest amount of period, in between the killings. So Helen Ritka was an 18-year-old prostitute. Now, she was murdered by Peter Sutcliffe only 10 days after the murder of Yvonne Pearson. The Yorkshire Ripper had once again expanded his territory at this point to now include the red light district of Huddersfield, a town that he had not previously, I think, ventured into in regards to his, devious deeds. Helen Ritka had a twin sister, Rita Ritka, and they were fairly new to the prostitution trade because they were both prostitutes. They had only worked for a few weeks and had evolved a way of defending themselves against men that might want to harm them. So this system that the twins had developed, to protect themselves against, the Yorkshire Ripper and other, evil men at that point, worked in this way. So they would always accept clients at roughly the same time. Now, the clients would precisely have 20 minutes and they would rendezvous back at the same place. So this was their technique. Now, an interesting detail that some of the other prostitutes in Bradford, I assume because, the Yorkshire Ripper was really terrorizing the community, they had developed their own system of protection. So it's just an interesting point to mention that these prostitutes in Bradford and Leeds actually had a system where they were working in pairs. Now, one of the prostitutes would take down the license number of the car that other prostitute was going off in, and then the piece of paper, with the license numbers would be ripped up in front of the driver when they returned. So, just to make sure that if, this other woman that I'm working with right now, if she doesn't return, within the time period that she is supposed to return, as of what the deal was, how much time they had to do their thing, pretty much. If that woman would not return, she would go to the police and tell them, this man took my friend, and they were supposed to come back at this point, but they didn't, and this is the license plate. So I think it's a genius idea, actually. Now, on January 31st, Helen and Rita Ritka, the twins, left their flat at around 8:30 p.m. to the red light area in Great Northern Street. At approximately 9:10 p.m., Rita saw her sister Helen get into a dark-colored car on the other side of the street. Now, Rita was shortly picked up by a man in a Datsun. Helen Ritka arrived back from the first piece of business that she did with that dark-colored car, because that was not Peter at that point. But then she was spotted by Peter Sutcliffe, who convinced her there was time for a quick one in the timber yard not far away. Because, at that point, according to the system that the twins ran, they were supposed to meet up at the same place and stay secure. But, Peter Sutcliffe actually convinced Helen that there was still time, and he drove into the timber yard with her. Sutcliffe planned to use the method of attack that he had ran with for the last few murders, I assume, suggesting that they do it in the back of the car and then attacking the woman when she gets out of the car to get into the back seat. That's when he would also get out of the car, and once the woman's getting into the back seat, he would hit the woman with a hammer. So that's what happened. With her back to him, trying to get into the rear of the car, Sutcliffe swung his hammer, but it caught the roof of the car and only grazed Helen Ritka, who assumed he had hit her with his hand. So she didn't know that it was a hammer. So in horror, she said, "There is no need for that. You don't even have to pay." Sutcliffe had expected her to immediately shout for help. Now that's his quote, that he was surprised that Helen didn't shout immediately. Soon he hit her hard on the head with a hammer, and she crumbled to the ground and began making a loud noise. He then suddenly realized that what he was doing was in full view of two taxi drivers who were parked nearby, but were oblivious to what was happening, actually. So Sutcliffe then grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the end of the woodyard. She wasn't dead yet, her eyes were open and her hands were up to protect her against further blows. He then got on top of her and covered her mouth with his hand. While she was still struggling, he went ahead with a sex act, so she was the only one of his many victims that he had actual sexual intercourse with. So that's interesting to note as well. After the taxi drivers had departed, Sutcliffe went and retrieved his hammer, and as Helen Ritka staggered to her feet and headed towards the car, he hit her with heavy blows to the back of the head. He then dragged her to the front of the car and proceeded to throw her belongings away. As it was obvious to Sutcliffe that Helen Ritko was still alive, he went to his car and grabbed a knife and then stabbed her several times through the heart and lungs. Before leaving, he hid her body behind a stack of timber. An interesting fact that when Peter Sutcliffe returned home to Bradford, he actually sponged off the spattered blood that was on his shoes, and the knife that he used to kill Helen, he actually returned it to the kitchen drawer from where he had taken it. So that knife was probably used for their daily kitchen activities, actually. Now, the next victim was Vera Millward. Now, this attack happened 104 days after Helen's attack. So, 3 months into the attack. So, who knows actually if he didn't kill any more women within those times, but that's the only ones that we have that are linked to him. So this woman, Vera Millward, was a 40-year-old prostitute living in a rundown council flat in Hulme, Manchester. She was murdered by the Yorkshire Ripper 3.5 months after the killing of Helen Ritka on May 16th. Vera Millward, a frail, sickly woman who had one lung and had 3 major operations in 1976 and 1977. She also had chronic stomach pains. Now, this woman left her home at around 10 p.m., telling her Jamaican boyfriend that she was going out to buy cigarettes. Knowing what she really meant, because she was apparently a prostitute, the boyfriend did not expect to see her for a few hours. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, this woman had a regular client who would usually park outside of her flat in Greenham Avenue and flash his car headlights. Now, this night, this man didn't show up, and Vera actually hung around for business with the car trade. This is the quote from the police. So, the car trade meaning that, prostitutes would sort of go to a car that would stop and sort of offer their services or whatnot. So, Peter Sutcliffe was actually the first person to come along and park next to her. Now, Peter and Vera drove for about 2.5 miles to the Manchester Royal Infirmary and a quiet spot in a parking compound where prostitutes and their clients were frequently seen. After getting out of the car, Sutcliffe attacked her with a hammer and Vera tried to fight him off. A man later claimed to have heard 3 screams for help from the hospital grounds, but decided they were from a patient at the hospital. After he had killed her with the hammer blows, Sutcliffe dragged her to a spot by a fence and began to stab her with a knife. So once again, Peter almost gets caught, but these circumstances just keep sort of falling in place for him, so he does not get caught again. So on the 4th of April, Josephine Whittaker, who was 19 and she was from Halifax, was killed. This happened only 33 days after his last victim was killed. Josephine Whittaker had been visiting her grandparents. She had to work the next day and insisted on walking home on her own. She left at around 11:40 p.m., so almost midnight, taking a route that would take her to Savile Park and across it to the suburb of Bell Hall, Halifax, and Ivy Street, where she had lived at that time. On the night of April 4th, Peter Sutcliffe had been out drinking with Trevor Birdsall, and shortly after closing time, he dropped Trevor off at where he was living. I found this pretty interesting. He was driving cars but also drinking, so I'm sure he was not allowed to do that. Instead of heading home, Peter actually went in the opposite direction and at around 11:30 p.m. had driven to Halifax and was cruising around the quiet residential district of Bell Hall and soon gravitated towards the playing fields of Savile Park. There were a few people walking their dogs And after several laps around the park, he spotted a young woman, the same Josephine Whittaker, walking on her own. He quickly parked, put a hammer and a rusty screwdriver which he had sharpened into his pocket, and began to follow her. Within minutes, he had caught up with her and began to talk to her as they walked. He asked her if she had far to go, and she replied that she had been at her grandmother's and, she was still gonna walk for quite a while. As they walked along on their way towards Sawal Park, they passed by a man walking his dog. The man would later report to police that he had seen a woman whose description and clothing were similar to Josephine Whittaker. She was apparently, according to this man, she was walking with a man who he had described as being age 19 to 22, so quite a bit younger than Peter actually was. Maybe he seemed young to these people, who knows. He also described the man as being 5'8" in height, of medium build, wearing jeans and a 3/4 length dark colored coat, who appeared to have not shaved for 3 or 4 days and had slightly wavy, greasy hair. So, as the pair approached the park, Josephine Whittaker told Sutcliffe that she normally took a shortcut across the field. As they started to walk across this field and were about 30 to 40 yards from the main road and out of the range of the street lamps, Sutcliffe asked her the time and marveled at her good eyesight, as she was able to tell the time from a nearby clock tower. Sutcliffe lagged behind, pretending to look at the clock, but in reality was removing the hammer from his jacket and getting ready to attack. Sutcliffe hit Josephine Whittaker from behind with his hammer and had knocked her to the ground, where she made some noises, and he hit her again as she laid on the ground. Now, this is a crazy part. Sutcliffe then noticed someone walking along the pavement where they had been walking a couple of minutes earlier. He then dragged, Josephine's body approximately 30 feet into the darkness away from the road. As he was crouched over the body, he was then horrified, this is his statements, to hear voices close behind. He turned and saw two figures hurrying across the field and watched as they passed close by him. A man walking by the park at the time of the murder said later that he had heard an unusual noise, and this is his quote, "the type of noise that makes your hair stand on end." But, Peter is still not apprehended, so Josephine was still making loud noises when Sutcliffe pulled her clothing back, turned her over, and then proceeded to stab her 21 times with a screwdriver in the chest and stomach and 6 times in her right leg. Her skull had multiple fractures after, she was found dead. And this leaves us with a few other victims. So Barbara Leach was also a murder. Now, this happened 150 days after the last murder. So Barbara Leach was actually a 20-year-old university student about to start her third and final year in social psychology. Barbara and her friends helped their landlord with tidying up. At around 12:45 a.m., even though it was lightly raining outside, Barbara decided to get some night air and go for a walk. None of her friends had wanted to go along with her for this walk. Peter Sutcliffe, driving through the area, saw her leave her groups of friends, and he saw her walking by herself. So he quickly drove past her and turned left into Ash Grove. As he opened the car door to get out of the car, she was walking towards him. Now, he let her walk past him before attacking her with a hammer from behind. He then dragged her into a backyard, and after pushing up her shirt and bra to expose her breasts and undoing her jeans and partly pulling them down, he then proceeded to stab her with the same screwdriver that he had used on Josephine Whittaker, 150 days ago. He then placed her body in a distorted jackknife position behind a low wall in an area where dustbins were usually kept. He covered her body with an old piece of carpet and placed some stones on top of it. This leads us to the next woman who actually was murdered 353 days ago. So at this point, the murders definitely expand. The time period definitely expand in between the murders. This was Margaret Walls. She was a 47-year-old civil servant who worked at the Department of Education and Science office in Pudsey. So she was definitely not a prostitute. So we can definitely tell at this point that this man is not hunting for prostitutes. He's just hunting for women in general at that point. Now, this woman worked late on Wednesday, on August 20th of 1980, working an extra few hours as she was going on a 10-day holiday the following day. She left her office at around 9:30 p.m. and at 10:30 p.m. She was walking in the streets. Now she had to walk the half mile to her home in Farnsley, a suburb of Leeds. Now, meanwhile, Peter was actually driving through Farnsley on his way to Chapeltown when he spotted Margaret Walls walking towards him. So he was probably driving to Chapeltown for one of his next murder victims, most likely, but he just stumbled across a better situation in between where he was actually going, and he parked his car and proceeded to quickly catch up and overtake her over a distance of about 400 yards near a driveway with high stone pillars. He stunned her with a hammer blow to the back of the head, shouting "filthy prostitute" as he struck further blows to her head. So I'm assuming that this statement "filthy prostitute" came from Peter himself. So he was thinking that she was a prostitute, but she was definitely not one. Then Peter looped a length of rope around her neck, tightening it as he half carried, half dragged her about 20 yards from the point of attack up the driveway and into a high-walled garden. There, while kneeling on her chest, he strangled her. After she was dead, he stripped her all of her clothing except her tights, and when he left her, he partly covered the body with grass, cuttings, and leaves. And this actually leaves us to the last murder victim, that Jacqueline Hill, who was 20 years of age. She was killed only 12 days after this other woman, Margaret Walls, was killed. She was aged 20. She was a student in the third year of her English degree course. She was returning home to her students' hall of residence in Haddingley, Leeds, on a wet, rainy Monday on November 17th in 1980. She had been at a probation officer's seminar in Leeds city centre and had caught a bus and got off at a stop along the main Leeds Otley Road at around 9:23 p.m. She crossed the road to walk approximately 100 yards to her residence. Meanwhile, Peter Sutcliffe was sitting in his car parked outside of the Arndale shopping center eating a carton of KFC fried chicken and chips. It was only 7 weeks previously that he had been at the same location and had seen Apadya Bandara, a 34-year-old doctor from Singapore that he attacked but failed to kill after a witness spotted him. So one thing to remember here, that as I'm describing all of these murders, in between these murders, he's attacking women and he's being unsuccessful in killing them. So these are not the only crimes that he's doing at this point. These are only the women who actually he manages to kill. So he watched Jacqueline Hill. As he watched, the woman walking, he quickly switched on, the car ignition and drove up Alma Road. After he drove past Jacqueline, he stopped his car and waited for her to walk past him. After she passed him, he got out of the car and began to follow her for a short distance before delivering a blow to her head as she was passing an opening. Seconds later, another woman, Andrea Proctor, began walking down the same road and Sutcliffe quickly hoisted his victim into a standing position before dragging her approximately 30 yards onto some spare land. And then, there he pulled her clothes off and stabbed her with a screwdriver repeatedly in the chest and once in the eye. So it's a lot of grim stuff, but yeah, that's pretty much just to round up his killings. I don't know how long I was talking about here for. It seemed like a while, so I'm definitely gonna let you chime in, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty horrible stuff. I mean, suffice to say, this guy was, I mean, just obsessed with doing really horrible things to specifically women. I mean, there does seem to be, I could see why someone would think that he was focused on prostitutes, especially given the statements out of his mouth. But really, it seemed like he was hating women. You almost, if you were going to get Freudian with it, you might want to say that maybe he was projecting his mother, who he like maybe resented for being a victim of his father or bringing him into the world, and him feeling like some kind of powerless little boy, and that's how he exerts his power, is just doing just unmentionable things. I mean, jumping on people's bodies and strangling them. It looks like he got to be quite skilled at doing horrible, cowardly murders to defenseless victims. Right? He does that. By the way, the profiling. Right? He's definitely an ambush killer, blitz killer, in the way he acts. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty horrible. I think I had a whole kind of thing I wanted to talk about Netflix. I think I'm going to save it for maybe if we come back to this topic, because I think the Netflix thing has so many different flavors and ways that we can take us. And maybe it's better if if we just circled to our reactions here at the end, because I think there's enough that we could cover here, and probably enough that I've already covered, that I think there's some points that I definitely wanted to bring up, and I wanted to see how you felt about.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that's really sad about, and Netflix does a good job about this, by the way, especially early on, is you really get to see the faces of the victims. I mean, you literally see the faces of the victims, but you also see their families. So that right away they start off with interviewing a couple of the children of these different women that were murdered, and they're coming from some pretty sad places in life. They're coming from kind of the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. They're really losing in life in a way, and have been victimized by society, in some cases victimized by their alcoholic mother, who leaves them home alone. And then their mother's killed, and then they're like basically orphaned. And I mean, I just wanted to say, you almost got the sense of like victims getting victimized by other people who were also kind of like doing badly in life. And it was really touching, I guess. I think that was the one thing I got to commend Netflix for, was putting a human face. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure back then.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Nobody was talking to those kids in the paper or the news, right? But now here we are 40 years later, 45 years later, and we get to actually see like, I mean, one of them, like the second victim, second murder victim, I should say, her teenage son had to identify her body. Oh.
Yeah.
And this is a lady that was working as a prostitute to help feed her family and her husband. And then, the 17-year-old son has to come see her brutalized body at the morgue. And oh my God, that was brutal. So I think that was a good thing to see, I think, in terms of humanizing it, and making you think about some of the social issues that were going on, which, are pretty deep. I mean, you got to wonder, like, what? So here's one thing that I thought of, and I couldn't help but think of is, are you familiar with the Beatles song Maxwell's Silver Hammer?
I'm not. Nah, I'm not.
Okay, it's from I think it's from Abbey Road. There's a song called Maxwell's Silver Hammer, and it's like a catchy song, but basically it's about a guy that does what this dude does. Like in the song, this is like a popular Beatles song, from like 1969, I think. This Maxwell character is like bing bing, like knocking people on the head with a silver hammer and killing them.
Wait, this is a Beatles song?
Yeah, it's a Beatles song. Yeah,
What?
I mean, this is their final album, Abbey Road, and it's the whole album is a masterpiece. But that song always bothered me because I didn't, even as a little kid, I didn't think that was too funny. And this is obviously after that album.
Yeah.
I can't. Well, though I will say, it looks like I feel like his first crime is right around the time that album came out. I can't help but think, all these hammers on heads, and who knows, maybe hammers are like a really frequent, instrument of assault. So maybe it's not that much of a coincidence. But I can't help but wonder if someone like him,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I always wonder, like, stuff like this. I mean, what he's doing is disgusting, right? Like, I think that's part of the reason why, especially the prostitutes, who, you know, were used to kind of men doing some maybe, you know, distasteful things, or, you know, stuff that a lot of other people would not, you know, want to deal with.
Yeah.
They were surprised by what he was going to, you know, like, they thought he wanted something else. And what he's really focused on is just this really gruesome, violent, like, I think even, I mean, well, we're not going to go into too much about it today, because we're going to probably save it for another episode if we ever do it. But, you know, even other prisoners definitely had something to say about what he did. So what he did, once again, this is one of those things where even by, like, the rules of other criminals and horrible human beings, this was way beyond, like, you know, even criminal decency, let's call it, right? So that's kind of interesting. I can't help but wonder what makes somebody get so fascinated with that. And, you know, it's worth pointing out that this isn't an era where movies got a lot, you know, popular culture and movies got a lot bloodier and a lot more gruesome. I mean, there are some movies from the 70s that are as gory and bloody, probably worse than anything you can see now.
Yeah.
You know, and I can't help but wonder, if this is like a mind virus. Like, do people get these ideas in their head, and if they're stupid or foolish or sick, do they get obsessed with it to the point where it's almost like pornography for, you know?
Maybe, because, you know, back in the day, when there weren't any of these movies, now that they're, you know, all of a sudden all over the place, maybe some of the people that, you know, could potentially be changed by these type of movies, they actually did end up getting changed, you know, psychologically, and they do end up going on, like, these killing sprees. I'm not sure if that happened to Peter, however, but I will say that, you know, probably right now everyone is pretty much used to, like, all of the, I would say, darker stuff. Well, maybe the current generation is once again not used to it, you know. I don't know, man. I don't really have any strong opinions regarding the movie scene. You know, I'm not much of a movie super fan, you know.
You know, the older I get, the more I worry about the power of images and sound, and, you know, like, this kind of full court press, that media does in your senses. I really feel like people could be almost hypnotized into, you know, I mean, a case in point, we just watched Avatar again, which is an awesome movie. And, you know, there were people that there was like a whole depression syndrome that happened after Avatar came out, because Avatar, especially if you saw it in 3D, which, by the way, best 3D movie ever. Oh yeah, dude, Avatar is still, just side note, Avatar to me is still the best 3D movie experience I have ever. I mean, it was like being there. It was probably in my top 3 movie experiences of my life, and I'm in my 40s. So, but there were people that got depressed after that movie, because, you know, the movie is kind of idyllic and has all this nature and wonderful stuff and the music and everything. Like, you can get hypnotized by media. So yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it there for now. Yeah. But now here's another thing I thought of.
Yeah.
Besides, we were talking about his small size and maybe his issues about his mom and him and his power. You know, okay, that's predictable territory. You know, once again, big tall Glenn picking on the little guy, on short guys. Okay, well, I'll get that out of the way. Maybe that's just my issues, but
what you got bullied by short guys?
Oh yeah, well, no, I'll just say I feel like a lot of short guys have a big chip on their shoulder about tall guys, whether or not tall guys actually did anything. And yeah, I mean, that's a whole other topic. We could do a show on that, but maybe that's a different channel.
Maybe that's a pass. Man.
Yeah, maybe I'll save that for my own channel someday. Yeah, I mean, what I will say is, here's another interesting thing is, it makes you wonder, especially for somebody that has more psychopathic tendencies, how much of some of this is like a curiosity about the other humans. You know what I mean? So it's somebody that doesn't have a lot of education. It's not somebody that ever had like an anatomy class. I mean, some of it almost seems like experimenting with, like, I mean, some of it seems rage-filled for sure, but some of it almost feels like it's like, what's the body like under this part? What's the body like under that part? What happens if I push here? In a very sick way, you know, it's almost like someone dissecting a frog. I don't know, like, but the person's a frog, unfortunately. Nobody wants to be the frog. But it's kind of weird, like, some of what he did, it wasn't clinical, but some of it
Oh
didn't
wait,
seem. You
are
know what
you
I mean?
suggesting that he was doing these just to see what the person was looking from? Oh, so this is your theory, right? That
Yeah, yeah,
he
just a
potentially,
thought.
yeah, just a thought that he, just a
Yeah,
thought. Obviously, it's probably you don't think that it's probably the most likely theory or anything like that,
no, no.
but just the thought that he was potentially doing these crimes just in order to sort of his curiosity of how like the body would react when it's getting penetrated by a screwdriver, things like that, right? Like he
Yeah,
was
yeah.
curious.
I mean, you see it. I mean, definitely, everybody has. Plenty of
Yeah,
us have macabre curiosity to see, like, videos of horrible accidents and deaths and things. So there's a natural curiosity
yeah,
about
yeah,
mortality and things, and certainly you see it with children when there's kind of violent child offenders. Some aspect of what they do, especially because their intellect and their apathy, sorry, their empathy, they have apathy. They don't have empathy. Their empathy isn't as developed yet. Maybe that's what's also going on here. Is maybe his empathy has been
I
almost
wonder
like
I
childlike.
wonder
Yeah.
if he had, like, when he was a child, because I don't have this information. I wonder, did he potentially torture animals? Because that's sort of like the go-to for most
Yeah.
of the people who do like these gruesome killings. They usually like start with, at least that's my general sort of viewpoint that I've got, that they start off with like animals. They start torturing animals. I wonder if there's anything like
Yeah.
that in Peter's background. I personally don't have this information.
No, I didn't see that. Yeah, the so-called McDonald triad of, like, torturing animals, bedwetting, and playing with fire, which, it's a little bit disputed now about how real that is. But yeah, I agree. It's like usually that's kind of almost like, if maybe that's like the alpha testing of doing horrible things to human beings is starting with small animals that can't fight back,
Yeah.
or that people don't notice as much. Yeah, I didn't see anything like that. I think that was the thing that puzzled a lot of people, was that aside from the domestic abuse going on in his family, allegedly, he didn't have a history of, like, other externalizing behavior, like attacking other children and getting into fights, and like other, he didn't have aspects of other antisocial personality disorder, constellations of behaviors that might have made it easier to pin it on him. I mean, yeah, I just it is interesting to think of too. Like, I guess, to switch gears for a second. Um, the Netflix series was interesting that it did, like I said, right or wrong. It made me aware of. I think they did a good job of depicting that the police force. I mean, it was the '70s, so there wasn't any kind of computerization of evidence. In fact, the room that they were keeping the evidence, the floor that they were keeping the evidence in for this case, had so much paperwork and crap in it from all the leads that they had to put concrete pillars underneath the floor in this high-rise
Wow.
building, or it would have collapsed. So
God
that's a
damn,
lot of.
that's a lot of paperwork, man.
Yeah, and it's not computerized. It's not indexed. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you had to use the card catalog at the library. That sucked, dude. So imagine that times like 100 or 1,000. I mean, you can't. I think some of it really was like
Yeah.
it was like a crossroads between societal change. They also mentioned, like, hey, the whole police force had recently gone through this kind of like aggregation process where, like, it went from like local police forces
Yeah.
becoming merged into like kind of like county level, and there was a lot of like kind of loss of like um, a loss of touch with the neighborhood, where like kind of the local beat officers who would have known all of these women in these neighborhoods and kind of had a better idea for like who didn't belong. Some of them were getting
Yeah.
moved, and yeah, so they kind of, it was like really bad timing. Well, good
Yeah.
timing for him, bad timing for them. So yeah, they lost that. They had a change in leadership. I think there was also like a sense that those beat officers, the ones that actually broke the case, a lot of times they actually did feel like maybe it was this guy, and they
Exactly.
would suggest it to their superiors. And that was where I wondered. It was interesting because the superiors were really focused on this profile of like this Geordie accent, which is weird. I can't even remember how they got on that. For some
It
reason, they got on.
was, yeah,
Yeah.
the Geordie accent. Let's remember that there was these tapes sent to that
Oh yeah, the hoax tapes, right?
senior investigator, Mr.
Oh,
Oldfield had received hoax letters and hoax
oh,
tapes that just one thing I wanna, before
yeah.
close the show. I think there's a few details we still have to like mention mention that are of real interest in this case. So there were these hoax tapes and hoax letters, taunting Mr. Oldfield, who was the lead investigator at that point, who actually died the same year that Peter Sutcliffe was apprehended because, like a few years down the line, because of his health deterioration, because of the case, because he had a lot of backlash after, everyone found out how he pretty much botched the case. So pretty much he gets these hoax tapes that had like a Geordie accent. So Geordie accent, I'm assuming that's from like Newcastle area, that's from my knowledge, from like the football teams in the UK. That's the only thing I can base my geography off on. So basically it's a whole different area from, Peter Sutcliffe was actually at. And actually they were this person, Peter Sutcliffe, was interviewed 9 times during the course of the investigation, and he was never even in the top 40 suspect list. And I will say that one of the officers at that point who was on the Netflix show, he said that he brought this information, I believe, to Mr. Oldfield, and then the investigator said, "Get out of my room with this nonsense. His accent is of a Yorkshireman accent. We're looking for a person with a Geordie accent, and pretty much if you come back with me with someone else who doesn't have like the Geordie accent, you will be like doing like road patrols for the rest of your police service." So it was, and yeah, that was pretty crazy because the man was not, he didn't have a Geordie accent, but they were solely focused on that because of some tapes that were sent by a hoaxer who was caught 25 years later, I assume. I think he was caught in 2005 because they decided because at 2005 pretty much the technology had evolved and the DNA detection was evolved, so they sort of linked the DNA of the hoaxer because he left a little bit of saliva on the letter because he was using he was licking the envelope to secure it. So that was a stupid idea, definitely. But for back in the day, they didn't know that down the line I will get caught. So he did 3 years in prison. He got sentenced to 8. There's a whole charade about that. So this is another detail I just want to mention. They were solely focused on a prostitute only killer with the Geordie accent, which Peter Sutcliffe was killing every woman he saw who was vulnerable at that time, alone in the street, and he was not from Newcastle area. So that's all I have.
Yeah, freaking scumbag. The guys, the people that were basically trolling the police and giving them false clues, and I mean, it had a more than noticeable effect on the case. It really just set it off on a totally different path. And I think it's more than fair to say that women died because of these jackasses. And I mean, really, 3 years seems too few years to pay for something like that. I mean, really, you almost want to give them more something close to a manslaughter sentence. So, okay, then finally, I'd like to kind of wrap it up. I think case in point, I'm going to put this out there, and then for any of our listeners, specifically from the UK, I would be really interested, from you living in this society, what you think of this thesis. So one of my theses was, when I was talking to my wife about this, was case in point, the kind of the lower level police officers, presumably more, working class, I guess, police officers, are not as educated or not as let's say, quote unquote, high class or middle class as the management in the police agency. They come and they're like, look, I mean, this guy looks like this guy we know. He's got the boots. He looks like the drawing. I mean, he fits a lot of his profiles. His tires, tires might even match. Just things where it's he keeps coming up on these lists, and then despite the fact that they had these kind of these red herrings that were steering them off to the Geordie accent and the prostitution focus. I wonder how much could you argue that the same classism and caste system and things like that they were criticizing, kind of as a whole in this Netflix series, how much of that was them not being taken seriously because of almost that same kind of oh, you don't know any better, you lower class than me, working class police officer. I know better. I went to, this university or that university. I really wonder how much of like if this is a theme in the Netflix thing. They didn't really go into it too much, but yeah, I mean, this thing was broken essentially by like just a kind of an innocent traffic stop or investigation by they called it good coppering. And I
Yeah.
was like, yeah, good coppering. Like, just police officers doing their job, you know, policing the community, asking questions, and, saved that lady's life, by the way, that was in the car with him.
Yeah.
So, without getting into all the other details, and like I said, we could even go into what happened to Mr. Sutcliffe, but I think it's worth holding up our sleeve for another episode. That's all I got to say about that for now. But I'd really be curious to see what our comments are about this.
Yeah, definitely. So this was episode number 78, I believe, of the Solvable Mysteries podcast. Definitely had a different feel to it this week because some dark stuff was sort of brought on. Yeah, this was definitely like a dark episode. I'm not really sure if our audience like are super into this type of things. Like, it's not like we're super into these types of like uh stories, and I'm definitely not like super into the depicting these horrible events, but yeah, it just had to be done. It's the Yorkshire Ripper, so it's a gruesome case. There's no other way around it. Now, for next week, I'm not really sure what we're doing for the next week. I'm not sure if we're gonna be doing like grim stuff like this super like on a super regular basis, but it's something that we wanted to do. I mean, it was a really interesting case to research. I had fun. By the way, guys, join us next week on another episode. Also, you can find this podcast on all of the podcast apps. We have seen a significant increase in the podcast downloads, just in general on like the apps, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, so on and so forth. So definitely catch us there if if it's more convenient for you to listen to us on there. And yeah, thank you for joining us, guys. We'll catch you on the next episode, and as always, stay safe and peace out.